Welcome everyone to our live webinar today on orthographic mapping. We're so pleased to have so many people joining us today. My name is Kelly Lewis. I'm a master instructor here at Brainspring. And together with my colleagues Denise Sherman, Marilyn Toms, and Esther Moreau, we put together this content for you. And we hope you find it really intriguing and interesting and informative. So I'm joined today in the studio by Esther Moreau, who is sitting with your chat questions today. So she's able to respond to any questions that you have or clarifications that you need. And then if there's anything she thinks that we should discuss, she'll break in and we can have a chat about it. Okay? So let's start by looking at our agenda for our webinar today. We are going to cover what orthographic mapping isn't. So the point of that is to bust any myths that might be out there. We're also going to, of course, define orthographic mapping. And we're going to talk about what you need to know about orthographic mapping. And then we're also going to discuss what might be some obstacles for your students when it comes to the orthographic mapping process, as well as ways that you can support your learners for this really important concept. Okay? So to begin, orthographic mapping is not new. So it is certainly a newer buzzword. The term orthographic mapping is new, but the process has been happening ever since humans learned to read. So the process has really been studied since the late 1970s. And it wasn't until about 2014 that Linnea Airy began using the term orthographic mapping to name this process that we're going to discuss today. Orthographic mapping is not a skill that we teach students. It's not something we're asking them to master. It's also not only used for irregular words. So that's a myth that's kind of gotten out there. We're going to talk about how we do use it for irregular words, but not only for irregular words. Orthographic mapping is not a visual process, and that might be a little surprising to people. A lot of us think that reading happens with our eyes, but really orthographic mapping is an auditory process. And if you're familiar with David Kilpatrick, he, in his book, Equipped for Reading Success, does a great job of proving to us how strong of an auditory process reading really is for us. So let's take a closer look at that auditory process. So here's a word on screen for you, and we want to keep in mind how reading works in our brain. So Kilpatrick points to studies as far back as the 60s, 70s, and 80s regarding this. So it's not the look of the word that we remember. If orthographic mapping was a visual process, you would have to learn this word in each of these forms separately. So mixed case, handwritten versus typed. And so as Kilpatrick explains, our brains don't retrieve a visual image of the words that we read. Instead, we're using an oral filing system for the words that we have in our long-term memory bank. So what exactly is orthographic mapping? Here is a picture of that book that I mentioned, Equipped for Reading Success. We highly recommend it here at Brainspring. And this is how David Kilpatrick breaks orthographic mapping down for us. He says that it's the process we use to take an unfamiliar printed word and turn it into an immediately recognizable word. So something we recognize so fast, we don't even realize it's happening. So let's do a little poll here. So I want you to think about what comes to mind when you hear the term sight words. What immediately pops into your head? It might be Dolch words. Maybe you think about the Fry word list or high frequency words, maybe that you use in a grade level list with your students. Maybe you think about word walls. Or maybe you have another idea that comes to you when you consider sight words. So as we talk more about orthographic mapping, I'm going to clarify how we are using the term sight words when we think about orthographic mapping. So we know that orthographic mapping is actually happening all the time. It's happening in the brains of our students. It's happening in our own brains. It's an automatic process, and it's unconscious. We do not even recognize that it's occurring. While reading and writing, we're establishing a relationship between phonemes and graphemes, and it's a very efficient process when it's happening as it should be. So we know orthographic mapping is used to store words in long-term memory. Skilled readers have an extensive orthographic lexicon. That's what Kilpatrick calls it. And they develop automatic processing. So we're not talking only about sight words in terms of Dolch words or Fry words, but the enormous amount of words that we know by sight instantly. So that's what allows us to learn and remember many thousands of words rather than just the limited amount that are explicitly taught. Orthographic mapping is really about storage for later retrieval, automatic retrieval. And the size of our sight vocabulary is key to reading fluency. That doesn't surprise anyone, I'm sure. Orthographic mapping is a segmentation task, so it involves pulling apart words and sounds in words, something we ask our students to do often. Orthographic mapping is how we store words using a phonological process. Remember, it's auditory. The brain processes and maps words auditorily, and that makes it entirely related to spoken language. It's also essential for fluency, reading fluency and writing fluency. So when students are writing, they're matching the sounds to the symbols, and that's reinforcing the commitment of new words to memory. So some things that you will want to know about orthographic mapping is that it is critical to long-term word retention, as I've mentioned, and that leads to comprehension ultimately. So orthographic mapping is what allows us to retrieve words from the page immediately and effortlessly. And so to be successful with comprehension, we know that readers need to be fluent and automatic. So think about what word recognition means. Kilpatrick likens it to recognizing a friend as soon as you see them. It's so instantaneous. Orthographic mapping results in a large sight word vocabulary, and that makes most or all words pop out from the page for readers. That's where we get fast and accurate reading from. Our brains connect the word's pronunciation directly to the letter sequence that we see. So the letter sequence in printed words is so meaningful because it matches the order of spoken sounds. So students can only recognize this if they have phonemic awareness. You can see how important phonemic awareness is to the process. We know that orthographic mapping can be direct or indirect. So what I mean by that is direct mapping is when we, as teachers, set up the connections for students. So we might use Elkanon boxes or similar activities, or we might have a discussion with our students about irregular sounds. So we do this at Brainspring as part of our red word process, that kind of conversation about irregular sounds. But indirect orthographic mapping is also happening. That's definitely happening when we're working with nonsense words, mixed case text, and invented spelling. There are prerequisite skills that are required for students to be able to orthographic map efficiently. They need letter sound knowledge. And that's the one part of reading that really is visual. Now, they also need to be at the phoneme level with their phonological awareness skills. So they need to be able to do analysis about specific sounds in words. We want them to be able to manipulate those sounds. Orthographic mapping is directly involved in comprehension. It allows students to get to the point where there's no conscious effort used in reading the words. The decoding part is happening so quickly. In fact, Kilpatrick helps us understand in his book how much information is accessed when we look at a word that we have orthographically mapped. Here's how he puts it. The word's pronunciation and meaning are all activated together because they're all connected in memory once the word is permanently mapped. So as an example, you have this word orthographically mapped. So when you see it, you instantly are able to access the sound of the word, including the S, which is an irregular sound. It sounds like a Z. You automatically remember and know that that is a long O sound. But at the same time, you're also accessing an image of that word. You know what a hose looks like. You can instantly make connections to your experiences or different types of hose that you've worked with. So there's an example of how quickly orthographic mapping is working to create comprehension as we read words. So what are some obstacles to orthographic mapping? What might be getting in the way of this very efficient process? Well, we know long-term word storage can take 1 to 5 exposures, and that's really dependent on a student's developmental level. So when a student is struggling to read, orthographic mapping is likely being impeded by one of these issues. So the first one I'm going to discuss is cueing systems. So cueing systems, along with whole language approaches to reading, they really don't address the memory of written words. When we prompt students to use a cueing system, like we might ask them about what makes sense, or we might tell them to skip a word and come back to it, or check the picture, we're really detracting from their ability to engage with orthographic mapping. Another obstacle is when students have inefficient sound symbol connections. So even if they know their letters and sounds, we need them to be efficient. We need them to be fast and accurate. That's really key to developing fluency, which leads to comprehension. So students who struggle with reading and writing, they haven't developed that automatic processing for those skills. Kilpatrick says they're stuck in perpetually controlled processing. You can surely picture students that just cannot get caught up. That's who we're talking about here. We also need to make sure students have efficient phonemic awareness. If they're not fast and accurate with their phonemic awareness skills, that is going to get in the way of orthographic mapping for them. So while many children naturally develop phonemic awareness skills that are necessary for orthographic mapping, some children need direct instruction. And we know phoneme skills are needed for decoding words, but we also need to realize that they're necessary for remembering the words that we read. Let's stop again, take a little poll. I want you to think about what skills you think are involved in the orthographic mapping process. We want to think about all the complicated processes happening in the brain at the same time. So which of these do you think is part of this process? Maybe phonics, maybe letter identification, could be blending and segmenting, writing, or maybe all of the above. And if that's what you chose, you are correct. It's just a multi-step process all occurring at the same time. So how can we support that process for our students? How can we make this easier, facilitate it for them, and promote it? We know that direct instruction of phonemic awareness is critical. We need to be having our students do phoneme segmentation and phoneme manipulation. The warm-ups that we do throughout our day, they develop those underlying skills that allow for orthographic mapping to occur. We also want to give students dictation practice with finger tapping. So we want them to be able to do segmentation using a multisensory process. That is going to connect multiple learning pathways in their brain, and it definitely leads to long-term retention. So you can see here there's a photo of a student in one of our Brainspring learning centers that's using our finger tapping process. Students pound and finger tap their dictation words, and that definitely leads to orthographic mapping. We also want to give students feedback and error correction as they're writing. So when we wait to grade a paper for an hour or a day, we miss out on that opportunity to draw attention to the connection between the phonemes and graphemes. So miscue correction is certainly an important part of this. So you can see here there are some tools that we use here at Brainspring to structure that dictation process so that students are orthographically mapping as they're writing. So we have our finger tapping mats and we use letter tiles with that one in the center there for our tap mats and even a mini tap mat. And you can see some girls putting those into use here. Anything that's going to help students segment sounds and match them to spellings, that's going to be beneficial. And Kilpatrick calls this the phoneme to grapheme mapping technique. So it's also important for students to do this with multisyllabic words and morphemes. I don't want to forget to mention that. We also can support orthographic mapping by having a discussion about regular and irregular spellings in our words. So irregular words are definitely a challenge for students, but we remove that challenge when we teach them using sound and spelling connections rather than having students attempt to use phonics strategies to decode those words. Our discussion allows students to adjust their normal mapping. So we want to make sure we're discussing parts of the words that are spelled phonetically, like the D in this word, and the parts of the words that are irregular. They have unexpected spellings, like the and the Z. Irregular words are also called opaque words. You might hear them referred to as opaque. A transparent word has one-to-one correspondence. So when you think of the word hat, it has 3 sounds and 3 graphemes.
Kelly?
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt, but a question came in, and I think it was referring to when you were showing the finger tapping the mats.
Yes.
And the question was, what can be used for older students? So as far as that segmenting?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so...
Well, there's lots of creative ideas, but at Brainspring, we have a program called Structures that is created especially for those older students. So it is more grown up and mature, but still takes students through the process of segmenting, which is so important. And so we have versions of those same tools that just look more grown up. The one for Structures looks like a human hand, actually, but it's still numbered, and it's still a structured strategy for students to use. There's lots of creative ideas out there, though. I've seen teachers use those. Pop It. Have you seen those, Esther? Just to touch something for each one of the sounds that they hear as they segment. So
yes,
the internet is
great
full of
idea.
those.
Yes.
Yeah. But certainly we do want to make it multisensory. That's the key here.
Thank you, Kelly.
Absolutely. So I was talking about transparent versus opaque. So opaque words, irregular words, they're lacking that one-to-one correspondence. So here are some examples. Same is not one-to-one because of that silent E, right? Bread has 2 vowels making 1 sound, so it does not have that one-to-one correspondence. And limb is another example. That B at the end, we do not hear it, so that is an opaque word. Now, if you're looking for more ways to promote orthographic mapping with your students, we cannot recommend Equipped for Reading Success enough. David Kilpatrick lays out so much reasoning and explanation in his book, but he also gives us some excellent activities, specifically in Chapter 6, that are very easy to implement, and he does a great job of explaining how they work and why they work for our students. So some examples are mapping rhyme units or doing phonemic awareness with rhyme units, look-alike words, that's similar to how we looked at all of the different versions of pair a little earlier, backward decoding, oral decoding, which involves spelling words out loud, and even reading sideways and upside down. That's just a few of them. There's quite a few fun activities that your students would certainly benefit from. So now's a good time for us to check back in with Esther and see if we have any questions for discussion.
Well, I've been kind of answering them as we go.
Thank you for that.
Yes. I'm sorry. Somebody had a suggestion about using a pool noodle for pounding, a Pop It for tapping, and Sensory 2 for multisyllabic words. So lots of ideas are coming in
I love that.
in reference to that. And just the fact that all of these are amazing ways to differentiate our instruction. Yes. And so lots of comments coming in. Yes.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
I'm so glad to hear that.
Yeah.
Well, we do want to let you know that if you have questions after the webinar, you can certainly put them in our comment section, and we'd be happy to engage with you and answer those.
Absolutely. Oh, here comes one right now.
Great.
With older students, it says you can use highlighters. Yeah, so it's another comment. Great.
Absolutely.
Great.
Thank you for sharing.
Laura's asking, you mentioned backward decoding. Can you explain that?
I would have to go back into Dr. Kilpatrick's book and to do it justice, but it has to do with looking at backwards words and how once you orthographically map them, you can read them without any trouble. Mm-hmm. He also shows how you can put like a sentence with no spaces, but because you've orthographically mapped the words, you can read them. So he discusses specifically how to set that up for your students and scaffold to get to that point. I think it's kind of magical stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, and we do recommend that book, Equipped
Absolutely.
for Reading Success. We sell it on our website, and you can get it anywhere
And
really
Amazon, yep.
on Amazon. But it's a wealth of knowledge.
It is.
Absolutely.
Yes. Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us today. We're really glad to have you, and we look forward to seeing you at our next live webinar.